Hi, my name is Buck August. I'm a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and a certified diabetes care and education specialist. I work at Inlow Medical Center, and I've worked there for about a year. I was with Feather River Hospital for 7 or 8 years before that. And then actually, prior to that, I was at Inlow, but I worked in the hospital. Now I work in clinics and I get to talk to people about their diet, mostly people with diabetes, but also covering other areas. I have taught a little bit at Chico State. I taught for 2 years there and taught a class in the nutrition department. And I'm just glad to be able to share with you all a little bit about diabetes. So, we're going to talk about what diabetes is, how common it is, and then the roles that diet and lifestyle can play in the management of diabetes. So, diabetes is a chronic health condition that affects how the body turns food into energy. A lot of what we eat, so especially the carbohydrates, we'll talk more about that, a little bit of the protein, fat, sort of. Eventually, those things can be turned into sugar, not so much the fat, but parts of the protein, especially the carbohydrates. The sugar in our blood, we call it glucose. So sometimes they'll say you're going to have your blood glucose tested. So, glucose is just the form of sugar that's in the blood. So we eat these foods, especially the carbs. It's broken down into sugar or glucose, and that sugar ends up in our bloodstream. So when our blood sugar goes up, it signals our pancreas that we need to release insulin. And insulin is what helps to open up our cells so the sugar can get from the blood and into the cell. The sugar needs to get into the cell where it can be burned up and used. So that could be cells like our muscle or our brain. It can also be fat. Eventually, some sugar gets stored as fat to be used later. But take home point here is that insulin acts like a key to get the sugar from your blood into your cells where it can be used as energy. So when somebody has diabetes, there's some issues here. It can be that the body isn't making enough insulin. So if you don't have enough insulin, the body has a hard time getting the sugar from your blood into your cells where it can be burned up and used. Sometimes people also develop what they call insulin resistance. And so, even though the body's making insulin, the cells are resisting that insulin. And so, when the insulin tries to open up the cell so the sugar can get inside, the cells are not receptive to that. So, it's too much sugar stays in the blood. And that, with diabetes, that's kind of the hallmark of diabetes is a high blood sugar. Now, there are a few different types of diabetes. There's pre-diabetes, which is kind of like borderline for diabetes. There's type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes. There's another type of diabetes called gestational diabetes, which is just it happens with pregnant women. But we're going to watch a short clip here that's going to talk a bit about pre-diabetes, but these principles apply to diabetes in general. So let me pull up this clip.
To fully understand prediabetes, it helps to know how food is digested. Your body needs a form of sugar called glucose for growth and energy. You get glucose from foods and from some drinks. Food is broken down into glucose in your digestive tract. From there, it enters your bloodstream and moves into your body's cells. The pancreas is an organ that sits behind your stomach. This organ makes a hormone called insulin and sends it into the bloodstream. Insulin is carried through the blood and attaches to the surface of cells. This creates a path for glucose to move inside the cells. The cells can then function and grow. If you have diabetes, the pancreas doesn't make enough insulin, or your body becomes resistant to insulin and can't process glucose that well. When this happens, glucose stays in the blood and doesn't move into cells. Your body's cells become starved for energy. If you have prediabetes, it means that your body is already having problems with the normal process of insulin and glucose. You have a bit too much glucose in your blood, and you're at higher risk for developing type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so that was just a visual of what we were just talking about. I'm more of a visual person. I know a lot of people are. It's easier to see those things and understand them. So again, same principles. We eat food, primarily the carbohydrates. They get broken down into sugar, which is glucose in our blood. Insulin helps open up the cells, get the glucose out of the blood into the cells where it can be used. So with type 2 diabetes, typically the body's still making insulin, pretty much always. Eventually, sometimes people stop making insulin, but it might not be making enough. So the pancreas will, there's cells in the pancreas, they're called beta cells. That's where the insulin's made. Sometimes those cells will die off, and sometimes the pancreas just can't make as much insulin as the body really needs. It can also be, just like that video was talking about and showing, that although the insulin is being made, the cells are resisting it. So again, that's called insulin resistance. And so because the cells are resisting insulin, too much sugar stays in the blood. So again, take home point, diabetes, we have too much sugar in our blood. Oftentimes type 2 diabetes can be managed with diet and lifestyle, but eventually people will often need medication. We're going to talk about the medications a little bit in a few. So this is an interesting thing. They used to call type 2 diabetes adult onset diabetes. That was because we normally didn't see this type of diabetes until later in life. Sadly, we're seeing it in younger and younger people. So they're seeing type 2 diabetes in definitely people who are less than 20 years old, but sometimes we'll even see it in like grade school kids these days. That might be related to weight. So as a nation, our weight has gradually increased over time. It might be related to poor diet, inactivity, so less activity outside, exercise and whatnot, more screen time, more insulin resistance, and then there could be some genetic factors too. And we'll talk about that on the next slide here. We'll talk about that. This is also funny. This is those old Quaker Oat commercials. Y'all might be too young to remember any of these, but the guy always would be on the commercials and talk about diabetes. So people develop type 2 diabetes for a number of reasons. Oftentimes it's in your genes. So like I was saying before, there can be genetic factors that play a role in developing diabetes. So like for me, my maternal grandma had diabetes. She had type 1 though. We're going to talk about that. Type 2, if your parents have type 2 diabetes, you're definitely more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. If you're of African American, Hispanic, Native American, or Pacific Island descent, much higher risk of diabetes. As we age, generally speaking, people's risk for diabetes goes up. The pancreas, like we are talking about, those cells eventually kind of burn out and don't work as well over time. Having a high blood pressure can be a contributing factor to diabetes. Having high cholesterol and or high triglyceride levels. Triglycerides are basically just the fat that's in your blood. And when we have too much triglycerides or cholesterol, those can contribute or be a risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes. Our weight plays a role. So if we're overweight, we're likely to develop type 2 diabetes. Overweight really plays a role in terms of insulin resistance. Some people who are under increased stress from an injury or an illness, sometimes that will actually trigger diabetes. And then for moms who have had gestational diabetes, that's that pregnancy type of diabetes, they're at like a 6 or 7 times higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So if they had gestational diabetes, hugely increased risk for developing type 2 diabetes. Now, type 1 diabetes is the idea is the same as type 2 diabetes. There's too much sugar in the blood, but this is a totally different thing. This is an autoimmune disease. So with type 1 diabetes, the immune system actually attacks the insulin producing or beta cells in the pancreas, and it kills off those cells so that the pancreas doesn't produce any insulin sometimes, or it just doesn't produce enough insulin and the blood sugar stays high. So with type 1, most people need insulin from outside their body. So normally we see this in children and young adults is when this starts. So like my grandmother who had type 1 diabetes, she had it from when she was like 7 or something. Like she was very, very young. She was kind of sick when she was a kid and developed a type 1 diabetes. It only accounts for about 10% of diabetes, so it's much less than type 2 diabetes. Type 2 is much more common. And pretty much everybody with type 1 diabetes needs insulin. There's a couple different types of insulin they use. And again, we'll talk about the meds in a minute. But right now we're going to talk about insulin. So insulin is not actually that old in the scheme of things, just under 100 years old. So these two gentlemen, Banting and Best, up in Canada. They were the ones who discovered insulin. There were a couple different people who were, working on figuring out what insulin was, but they discovered it, and they used is kind of gnarly, but they actually ground up pancreas from dogs, and they used that and would inject the ground up pancreas, and there would be some insulin in that. Eventually, though, they figured out how to purify it, figure out just the insulin part. So, um, but yeah, kind of gory, kind of gnarly. But that's the way science is done sometimes, at least historically. So prior to discovering insulin, people still had diabetes. So we'd still have kids who developed type 1 diabetes. And since we didn't have insulin to treat them, what they would do was would put the kids on a really low calorie, low carbohydrate diet. And so you can see in the black and white pictures there, the little guy on the left, he looks really thin, kind of emaciated. He was on a calorie carb restricted diet. So he was one of the early ones to receive insulin. And you can see after he got insulin, he really filled out. So his body was able to store fat and was able to utilize the foods he was eating, so he didn't have to be on that same diet anymore. So it had a huge impact. These kids would just be suffering and wasting away. And then once we had insulin and it was into production, saved lives. So diabetes is really common. 29.1 million people have diabetes in the United States. So that's about 1 out of every 11, so just under 10%. 1 out of 4 people don't actually know that they have diabetes. So it's really common for people to be going throughout their lives, living their lives, maybe having some symptoms, but not recognizing them as symptoms as diabetes, but their blood sugar can be running high. So a lot of times people who would come to see me who are new to diabetes, especially new to type 2 diabetes, so typically adults, they might have had this going on for quite a while. Then they went in and had some labs drawn, and they looked at their blood glucose. So again, glucose, that's a sugar in the blood, or some other labs that they'll look at, and found out, oh man, your blood sugar's been running really high. Sometimes it's more dramatic than that. Sometimes people end up having to be in the hospital if their blood sugar gets crazy high, because it can cause a whole bunch of side effects. So people will lose weight, have low energy, be really thirsty all the time. Sometimes they have to urinate all the time, because when our blood sugar is really high, part of the way the body tries to get rid of that sugar is to pee it out. So those are some telltale signs of diabetes. Again, really hungry, low energy, having to pee all the time, weight loss. Those can all be signs of diabetes. So over the course of time, the prevalence of diabetes in the United States has really increased. So this is back in 1994. And you can see that most of the states had less than 4.5%, or maybe 4.5 to 5.9 or 6%. So it's pretty low. A couple states are a little bit higher, that 6 to 7%. So then we're going to jump forward 6 years to the year 2000, year I graduated high school. And you can see the colors changed a lot. So we have a lot more who are in that, basically 5%, 7%, and then a few states that were up to more like 9, or one state is up to more like 9% of the people diagnosed with diabetes for adults. And jump forward another 5 years to 2005, and you can see how, Texas and over to the east, the percentage is increasing, so more around 7 to 8%, a few that greater than 9% of the population of those states amongst the adults have diabetes. Then jump forward another 5 years to 2010, and you can see it just continues to spread, so the prevalence of diabetes just continues to go up. And jump forward to 2015, and then it's just again continuing to increase. So most states, it's more than 9% of the adult population has diabetes. Now it's interesting to look at this. So you can see again, this does 94, 2000, 2015. So the top looks at the percentage of people who are obese in the states. And basically, the percentage of diabetes, type 2 diabetes especially, has a tendency to follow the percentage of people who are at a higher weight. Now, I'm not super concerned about people's weight necessarily. If someone's healthy, if they're eating a nutritious diet, they're staying really active, We can generally avoid a lot of these things like diabetes and high blood pressure. What's more important is our diet, activity, healthy lifestyle. But there definitely is a correlation between weight and developing type 2 diabetes. And you can see that when you look at how over the course of time, again, people's weight has gone up, prevalence of diabetes has gone up. So it's interesting food for thought. Again, I'm not super focused on weight, but it is an interesting correlation. So why is diabetes a bad thing? Why do we care about high blood sugars? Basically, having too much sugar in your blood is toxic to your body. So it is really hard on things like our eyes because we have these really sensitive vessels in our eyes. So if anybody has had an eye exam, sometimes they'll take a picture of your eye, or sometimes when they're shining the light in your eye, you can kind of like it's this weird sensation where you're looking and you can kind of see the vessels in your eye as that light's shining. So those vessels are really sensitive to high blood sugar. Kidneys are really sensitive to high blood sugar. Our heart can be. And then also, diabetes can cause neurological issues. So things like fingers and toes, people will often have damage to their fingers and toes. They'll develop what's called neuropathy, where they will get like numbness and tingling in their fingers and toes. Oftentimes, people with diabetes will have toes or even like a whole foot amputated, cut off, because they have poor circulation to their extremities, so like, their feet and their hands, and maybe they get a little injury on their foot. That injury doesn't heal properly, it gets infected, and because they can't feel what's going on, that infection can get really bad, so bad sometimes that the only course of action they can take is actually have to, have that toe or have their whole entire foot or leg below the knee cut off. So really dangerous. So diabetes really tends to wreak havoc on people's bodies. This is mostly when it's out of control though. If people are able to keep their blood sugars on target, it really helps to avoid these consequences. So oftentimes people wonder, is there a cure for diabetes? And unfortunately, there's no real cure. There's a bunch of different ways to treat it. Things that tend to help with diabetes, if somebody is overweight, losing weight oftentimes helps to lower blood sugars. The main way it's doing that is that it helps to decrease that insulin resistance. So when people lose weight, their body is actually able to utilize their insulin that their body's making better. Eating healthy. So a huge factor in terms of our blood sugars is what we're eating. And what we're going to talk way more about that. Being active. So physical activity is another thing that overcomes insulin resistance. So when we're active, whether that's walking or dancing, playing sports, whatever it might be, our body is burning up sugar, and the activity actually helps to open up the cells so that the blood sugar goes down. Just being knowledgeable about diabetes has a tendency to help people take better care of themselves and keep their blood sugars on target. Taking medications as needed. So if somebody's diabetes is not under control, their doctor puts them on medicine, it's really important they actually take it. It's actually pretty common that people don't take their prescriptions or don't take them on a regular basis. It's really easy to forget. Like if you're taking a multivitamin or something like that, you might find you'll forget a day or forget a week just because it's not in your routine. So the same happens with prescription medication sometimes. And then also just following with a healthcare team. So people with diabetes coming to talk to someone like myself, who's a dietitian and a diabetes educator, that can really help them to better manage their diabetes. So yeah, watching our weight, being active at least 30 minutes a day. So they found that 30 minutes of walking daily is shown to decrease diabetes risk by 30%. So that's pretty significant. Eating healthy, again, so diet and lifestyle can decrease diabetes by 58%. Keeping alcohol moderate is always a tricky one. So for women, that's one drink per day. A drink is 12 ounces of beer, ounce and a half of hard alcohol, 5 ounces of wine. For guys, up to 2 drinks a day is what they consider moderate. And then avoiding smoking. Smoking tends to do a lot of damage that's really similar to what diabetes does. It's really hard on our vessels and things like that. So not smoking can help to keep your body healthy and help keep diabetes away. So when it comes to treating diabetes, there are a lot of different medications. This can be a bit overwhelming, but basically, I just want you to take a look at this and see how these different medicines work. So, metformin is the most common type of medication for type 2 diabetes. So, that adult, what used to be called adult onset diabetes, where the body's still making insulin. So, what metformin does is it actually helps in a couple ways. It helps the body to be more sensitive to the insulin. So, it helps to overcome that insulin resistance. And another way that our blood sugar can come up is actually our liver releasing sugar into the bloodstream. So the liver normally has this big store of sugar. And when the body, like when our blood sugar starts to come down, the liver will release sugar into the bloodstream. Now, with diabetes, sometimes that gets out of whack, and sometimes the liver just releases too much sugar and the blood sugar level stays too high. So, metformin helps to decrease the liver releasing that sugar. So the liver releases less sugar into the bloodstream. Insulin is used, it's definitely used for type 1 diabetes. It's sometimes used for type 2 diabetes when people are having a really hard time getting their blood sugar down. And so, the same way that our pancreas releases insulin and that helps to lower blood sugar, when you inject insulin, and unfortunately, that's the main way we can take insulin. There are some inhaled insulins, but mostly it's injected. So when you inject that insulin, it is definitely going to lower your blood sugar. When people are really insulin resistant, sometimes it takes a lot of extra insulin, but eventually you'll get to a point where the insulin is going to lower the blood sugar. Now, there's some different medications that work in different ways. Some medications actually play a role in terms of digestion and absorption. They might slow down digestion, and by doing that, the blood sugar is going to go up more gradually. So that can help the blood sugar from spiking up high. Some medications tell the pancreas just to release more insulin. And so, as long as the pancreas is producing insulin, those medications can help the pancreas to release more. So, you would take that like half an hour before you ate, and then the pancreas would release more insulin, help to lower the blood sugar. Some medications actually play a role in our brain and they can affect our appetite. So sometimes people with diabetes have a higher appetite, and those medications can help to lower the appetite some. Our kidneys, like we were talking about before, when blood sugars are running really high, part of the way the body tries to get rid of that sugar is to urinate it out. So some medications actually help the kidneys basically to release more sugar in our urine. There's other medications that just work by making the muscles and our cells more sensitive to insulin. So that again is overcoming that insulin resistance. So, take on point, these medications can work in our gut, our pancreas, our brain, our kidneys, our muscles, our fat cells, and the liver. So, there's a whole bunch of different ways that these diabetes medications can help the body to lower the blood sugar level. And again, that's the whole point is we're trying to keep the blood sugar levels lower. So, nutrition can play a huge role in terms of diabetes. It's really one of the main strategies. So, if somebody develops prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, yeah, type 1 diabetes as well, the first things that we're going to work on diet, lifestyle, so activity, and then medication if needed. So, what we eat really directly impacts our blood sugar levels. Altering the diet may help to improve blood sugars and prevent the consequences of diabetes. Because again, when sugars are high, when blood sugars are high, that's toxic to our body. So if we're able to keep those blood sugars down, then it's the cells will be healthier. For some people, we talked about this a little bit earlier, losing weight can play a role in terms of diabetes because it can help to overcome that insulin resistance for some people. And again, I'm not hugely focused on that, but it definitely can play a role. So when it comes to nutrition, where are we going to focus? Macronutrients, so carbs, so carbohydrate foods are the main ones that affect blood sugar. Fats do minimally, proteins do pretty minimally. We can focus on eating more whole foods. We can focus on balanced meals. We can also focus on the frequency of eating. So what's a diabetic diet? These have really changed over time. So if you remember, we were talking about the development of insulin. So before they developed insulin, they would put people on really low calorie, low carbohydrate diets. Sometimes they would be called semi-starvation diets. Sometimes the calories actually weren't all that low, but most of the calories were coming from fat. because fat doesn't require insulin the way that carbohydrates do for our body to utilize those calories. So these days, a keto diet is really popular. And it's kind of funny that diets tend to go in waves over the years, they kind of come and go. So a keto diet, in theory, would actually be pretty friendly to blood sugars because it's very low in carbohydrates. So it's really low in the foods that really tend to raise blood sugar. It's really high in fat, and the body is able to use the fats to make ketones to use as energy. And so that can actually be a decent way of controlling blood sugar for some people. For some people, it works really well. So, okay, going back historically again, so we had those low carb, semi starvation diets, and then the diabetic diet for years was focused more on high carbs. Maybe they would say like complex carbohydrates, but they wanted people to be consistent with their carbs and lower fat. And so low fat diets were popular for years and years and years. The Atkins diet kind of pushed those out, and then like paleo, keto, things like that. A lot of the focus on carbohydrates in more recent decades has changed to the quality of the carbohydrates. So we're talking about complex carbs. They could be talking about things like the glycemic index, and that's looking at how foods affect blood sugar levels. And then again, back to low carb, keto type of diets are popular these days. Also, intermittent fasting, which sometimes runs in those same circles, the paleo diet circles, keto diet, and stuff. Oftentimes, people will use intermittent fasting, and there's some argument that that can help with the body utilize blood sugar better and be more sensitive to insulin. So, we've been talking about the different foods and how they impact blood sugar. So, this is a really interesting way of looking at it. Up and down on the graph is blood glucose or blood sugar, and then side to side is hours. So when you eat carbohydrates, the orange one, the big peak there, you can see that they start to raise blood sugar quickly and they raise it high. Certain carbs more than others. So again, carbs have the biggest impact on blood sugar, the most immediate and the most significant. Protein will raise blood sugar some because parts of proteins are made up of amino acids, and parts of those amino acids can be broken down and used like glucose. So protein will raise the blood sugar some, but nowhere near what carbohydrates do, and it's a much more gradual thing. And then fat has the least impact on blood sugar, and it's again it's super gradual, and it's the most minimal. So again, carbs have the biggest impact on blood sugar. And carbohydrate foods, oftentimes people are aware of certain things that have carbs, like bread and rice. Most people realize that. Oatmeal, fruits, so sugar that comes from fruit. It's natural sugar, but it's still sugar, and it's going to raise your blood sugar. Sweet potatoes, acorn squash, things like that. Some veggies are starchy. Corn is another starchy vegetable. Beans have some carbohydrate. They have some starch in there. And starches, on a chemical level, all starches are chains of sugar that are stuck together. So when you eat a starchy carb like pasta, in our body, the body breaks that down into sugar, into glucose. So it's going to, again, it'll raise your blood sugar, your blood glucose. So carbs have the biggest impact on blood sugar. There's this thing called the glycemic index, and it's an interesting way of thinking about carbohydrates and the impact that they have on our blood sugar. So the higher a glycemic index, the higher it raises blood sugar. Basically, the higher and the faster it's going to raise your blood sugar. So a high GI food, like if we look in the starch column, all the way down at the bottom is a baked potato that has a glycemic index of 85. They consider anything over 70 to be a high glycemic index. So basically, if you eat a baked potato, it is going to spike your blood sugar fast. White bread, oftentimes has a real high glycemic index. The glycemic index, the numbers vary because they do different people have done studies on it, so not all the numbers are the same. But generally speaking, foods like white bread are going to have a high glycemic index. This table is a little different than a lot of the ones out there. If you look in the vegetables column, though, you see that things like broccoli, peppers, lettuce, their glycemic index is extremely low. There's only a few veggies that will really raise blood sugar much, and that's peas, carrots, beets, and then like hard squashes like acorn and butternut squash. Fruits, the glycemic index, the impact on the blood sugar really varies. So some things like apples and cherries have a pretty low glycemic index, but other things like watermelon, Tropical fruits like pineapple and then dates will have a very high glycemic index. So those will really make the blood sugar go up quick. Dairy products often times have a lower glycemic index because it's a different type of sugar in dairy products. It's lactose, and lactose tends to not raise blood sugar quite as much. So you can see that things like plain yogurt, very low glycemic index, even ice cream has like a medium glycemic index because it has a bunch of fat in there and some protein, and so it doesn't spike blood sugar like a baked potato would. And then snack foods, things like pretzels and candy, will definitely spike that blood sugar. So, like we're talking about, protein foods have much less impact on blood sugar. And again, it's because they're a totally different food. Protein is different than carbohydrate. So we get protein from things like meat and fish, eggs, nuts are a pretty good source of protein. They also have a lot of fat. Nuts do have a little bit of carbohydrate, but they're going to have a real minimal impact on blood sugar because of all the fat and protein. Beans, like we talked about a minute ago, they do have some starch, but they also have quite a bit of protein. So beans are much more gentle on blood sugar than something like rice would be. And eggs, and the dairy products will have a lot of protein. And fats, like we talked about, they have the least impact on blood sugar. There's different types of fats. So things like butter, cream, fatty meats, we don't always consider those the healthiest foods. There's been a lot of controversy about that, especially in more recent years. But generally speaking, it's probably a good idea to go easy on butter, go easy on bacon and processed meats like pastrami, salami, things like that, and to choose more plant fats. So that's things like olive oil, which is about the best oil that you can choose, avocado, and nuts and seeds. So I'm a big fan of like chia seeds, flax seeds. I'll put those on my oatmeal, maybe with some almond butter or something in the morning. Those are good, healthy fats that have been shown to be very heart healthy. All these things are blood sugar friendly. So those are good choices in terms of fats. And so how do we balance these out? A good way to think about it is what they call like a plate method. So when I was growing up, we used to have the food guide pyramid. They got rid of the pyramid. They replaced it with a plate. It's called MyPlate. Y'all might have learned about that in school. The MyPlate itself is not my favorite one. There's a nice one from Harvard called the Healthy Eating Plate, or just something like this. I think is probably even better, where basically you think, okay, I'm going to take half my plate. I'm going to fill that with a non-starchy type of vegetable like broccoli or salad. I'll take a quarter of my plate and it'll be for protein, and a quarter will be for some sort of starch, preferably like a whole grain. So with the protein, another way to think about it is it's a palm of protein, and so that's proportional to the person. So my palm is probably like, I don't know, 5 ounces. If it was a piece of meat, it would be like 5 ounces, maybe 6 ounces. And then somebody who was smaller and dainty, they'd have a palm that was, 3 or 4 ounces or whatever. So that's proportional to the person. For our carbs, I tell people, if you're real active, probably like a fist is a good ballpark for your carbs. So if you think about like pasta or potato or bread, if you're not so active, maybe like a cup tan would be a better portion. So like basically what a scoop would be. Vegetables, at least a fist of veggies, maybe 2 fists, especially if it's like a leafy green, like a salad. And then for fats, like a thumb is a decent serving. It can be the tip of your thumb or it can be your whole thumb. Tip of the thumb would be more like, butter or oil. A whole thumb, peanut butter, something like that, which peanut butter is a protein and a fat, and like we said, a tiny bit of carbs. So that's just a different way of thinking about your meals, balancing out in a plate like that. And the other thing you can do if somebody is working on decreasing their calorie intake, they've done studies where if you just use a smaller plate, that tends to help, and it helps you to feel full with less food if you use a smaller plate. Whereas if you use a huge plate and you put small portions on that huge plate, the visual that your brain sees, all that space on the plate, people oftentimes feel less satisfied. So using a smaller plate can be a good strategy. Smaller plate, smaller bowl. For things like cereal at home, I'll often use like a coffee cup instead of a big cereal bowl. Another good way to think about healthy eating is just trying to choose more whole foods. Whole foods, minimally processed foods. I remember when I was in school and studying nutrition, one of my professors would talk about as close to natural as possible. And for whatever reason, my brain had trouble wrapping around that for a long time. But basically, what we're saying is, if it's something like a kiwi, so like you see a kiwi there, That when you eat the kiwi, take the skin off the kiwi, but when you eat the whole kiwi itself, that your our body tends to process those things pretty well. There's a lot of fiber in things like fruits and vegetables. So when you eat the fruit or the vegetable itself, all that fiber, all sorts of nutrients in there, it's really good. And our bodies process those things well. But over on the right there, we see there's like a half an orange. If you ate that half an orange, got all the fiber, it's going to take your body a while to break that down. The blood sugar is going to go up a little more gradually. But if you took, 4 oranges and you juiced them and you drank a glass of orange juice, the sugar would still be there, but it wouldn't have the fiber. And so when you drink it, it will cause blood sugar to go up really quickly. With somebody with diabetes, sometimes people have what they call hypoglycemia, which just means a low blood sugar. And so oftentimes we'll give those people some juice to raise their blood sugar because we know juice will spike blood sugar right up. So generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of drinking a lot of like fruit juice or other sweetened drinks like regular sodas or caramelizer from Dutch Bros or something because they tend to really wreak havoc on our blood sugar. Maybe as a treat or something once in a while, but it's not like an everyday food. So again, take home point: eat foods as close to natural as possible. Choose whole grains instead of the refined stuff. So that means things like brown rice or wild rice instead of white rice. If you like bread, doing like a whole grain bread instead of a white bread. Those type of things tend to do better for our body. When I was a kid, I used to read these books all the time, and I remember this one in particular. It's called Too Much Junk Food. I don't like to think of candy and sweets and stuff as junk food necessarily, but in the book, it talks about them as sometimes foods. And I think that's a good way to think about it. I love sweets, especially candies and things like that. And I eat them. I eat them on a regular basis, but I try to be mindful of how much I eat, and I try not to do it, all day, every day. So try to choose a lot of real whole foods. So coming back here, um, lean meats, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, things like that, and then some treats. So when people eat a lot of things like refined grains, processed meats, and a lot of added sugars, their health in general tends to not be as good. And those things definitely can contribute to blood sugar issues, aka diabetes issues. Not that they're going to cause you to have diabetes, but they can contribute to trouble with blood sugar. So when we talk about refined grains, really what we're doing is on the left there, you can see that's a whole grain. It has three main parts: the bran, the germ, and then the starchy part in the middle. So bran is where most of the fiber is. Fiber slows down digestion. There's also like vitamins and minerals in there. The germ is where most of the nutrients are. So sometimes people eat wheat germ. It's kind of an old school thing. Like you go to a health food store and get some wheat germ. And the reason why people do that is because, again, that's where most of the nutrients are concentrated. So if you eat the whole grain, you're getting the fiber, you're getting the vitamins, minerals, and everything, and you're getting the starchy part. If you eat a refined grain, they've stripped off the outside, the bran, so you're losing all the fiber and some vitamins that are there. You lose the germ, so you're losing most of the nutrients, and all you're left with is the starchy part. And because so many nutrients are stripped out when they refine grains, they actually will enrich them or add some of those nutrients back in to make up for the deficit. So, take home point here again: whole grains, whole foods. Processed meats are, in my opinion, delicious, but when we look at research, people who eat a lot of processed meats tend to not be as healthy. They tend to have higher rates of cancers and different things like that. So try to go easy on the processed meats. Choose, like if you go to the store or the butcher or whatever, get meat that's not processed. So just, chicken breast, chicken thighs, cuts of steak, maybe some leaner ones. Try to get some grass-fed beef if you can, and try to go easy on pastrami, salami, things like that. Now, added sugars, sugar in general has become a real big issue in more recent years. We're realizing more and more that sugar is not so great for our health, especially in high quantities. Again, I consider these sometimes foods, try to make good choices. I always say like 80%, 90% of the time. But there's that other, the sometimes where there's room for the sweets and treats that we really enjoy. So things like sugary drinks, so that could be like chocolate milk, Gatorade, soda, like I said, Dutch Bros, Starbucks. Some of those drinks have a ton of sugar, and even juice. Breakfast cereals. I love cereal, but some of those breakfast cereals, even ones that are sold as like healthy things like granolas and stuff, can have a ton of sugar in them. Yogurts can have a bunch of sugar added to them. Smoothies, so they'll sell something as a smoothie, which sounds healthy because it's a smoothie, but really it's just like a milkshake, essentially, just tons of sugar. Syrups and sweets, so things like syrup, honey. Oftentimes people ask me, oh, is honey a better choice than sugar? And to our body, it's not really that much different. It still sees the sugar molecules as sugar. Agave had become popular for a little while because agave tends to raise blood sugar less. But the reason is because it has a ton of fructose. So you've heard that like high fructose corn syrup is not so good for you. Agave can have even more fructose than high fructose corn syrup. So also probably not a real health food. Jellies and jams, candy, frozen treats, ice cream, frozen yogurt, all those things. And then sweets, baked goods. So like sweet rolls and cakes and cookies and pies. Again, sometimes foods want to go easy on the added sugars. What they say is that for women, try to keep it under 6 teaspoons or 25 grams of added sugar a day. So teaspoons, that's literally those little measuring, teaspoon app that you might have in your cabinet cupboard at home. But on food labels, sugars are listed in grams. And for men, they say 9 teaspoons or 36 grams. And so if you look at the food label, they actually changed these recently where if you go down, it says total carbohydrates is 37 grams, dietary fiber is 4 grams, total sugars, and then below it, it has the added sugars. And this has 12 grams of added sugar. So we'll hop back. So that would be about half of the daily value for a lady and about a third for a guy. The percent daily value they use on the food labels here is different than what the American Heart Association and other organizations recommend. So this is the more conservative recommendation. Sorry. All right. So that's helpful on the food label. Again, you can see right there the added sugars. Now, it's really interesting to look at something like a can of Coca-Cola. So it has 39 grams of carbs. All of those are sugar. All of those are added sugar because where else would it be coming from? So that is way more than what they would recommend for a woman in a day, only 25 grams. And even for a guy, 36 grams. That one can of Coke has 39 grams of added sugar. So really high in sugar. So, and again, their percent is based off of 50 grams or 12.5 teaspoons a day, which is higher than the other recommendation. So even if you shot for keeping it under this, you follow the percentage that it has on these food labels, that would still be probably a lot less sugar than the average American. So take home from points from all this, some good wisdom from Michael Pollan, the author of In Defense of Food and Food Rules. He says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So choosing real foods, so things that are less processed, things when you read the ingredients list, you can pronounce the ingredients, is probably a good idea. Going easy on the processed foods, especially the refined grains and added sugars, and paying attention to hunger and fullness. So that's just good general nutrition. And all of these things, like a diabetic diet, is really just a balanced, wholesome diet that is good for everybody. So all of us should be choosing whole foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts and seeds, things like that. Going easy on added sugars, going easy on processed foods. So that's just a good way for all of us to eat. If you have questions, I'm more than willing to answer questions, and maybe you can submit them, and I can get a list of questions, and I'm glad to answer them. Sorry I wasn't able to come in and speak with you all with these crazy times right now, but I'm glad I was at least able to share some. And yeah, if you have questions, please let your professor know, and I'm glad to answer them. Take care.